Hi guys, welcome to Lecture 1 on the respiratory system. Uh, may have heard a little bit about the respiratory system in recent days due to the pandemic of 2020. The country shut down, the world shut down all over. Tiny little infectious agent called a virus, particularly the coronavirus, uh, that causes a disease called COVID-19. So hopefully we're all protected against that. And I've moved the sequence this year around a little bit. Typically, we'd move into the cardiovascular system, but since we have a very important current event, we're going to learn about the respiratory system. Well, the respiratory system has some major components and some major functional processes. And of course, just the bottom line is it's the exchange of gases. And, you know, there's all kinds of adaptations for gas exchange. If you did the planaria lab in your biology class, you probably learned that planaria simply allow gases to diffuse readily through their membranes. Of course, you never should handle amphibians because they have that same capacity. They have the capacity for gas exchange through their skin. We do it a little bit differently. We have internal respiration, but to be specific, there are a number of different processes involved. So that respiration is made up of the first process of simply ventilation. So ventilation is this movement of gas, of air into the lungs and out of the lungs. Ventilation. So that's movement of air. Next is external respiration. And external respiration really involves the movement of the gases in the air, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and of course nitrogen. Nitrogen's being moved around to a degree. And we'll allude to that later in our discussion. But external respiration is the exchange of gases at the alveolus. And so here in the diagram you can see a little collection of these grape-like structures, the little blind sacs called the alveoli, plural alveolus. And each alveolus is surrounded by a bed of capillaries. All right, so those little blind sacs are perfused with blood, and that blood is carbon dioxide rich when it gets there, and it leaves full of oxygen and depleted of CO2. So that process where we have gas exchange at the alveolus is called external respiration. Next is transport. So your blood transports gases around the body, and your blood perfuses tissues. So the transport of gases, oxygen to the body, CO2 away from the tissues, is a central function of the respiratory system. Next, we have internal respiration, and that's the gas exchange between your blood, the blood in your capillaries, with the various tissues that are being perfused. So external respiration is in the lungs, internal respiration is in the body's tissues. And then last but not least is the process of cell respiration. So we've spent some time talking about cellular respiration in our unit on biochemistry. Cell respiration is central metabolic process in living things where glucose is combined with oxygen and produces carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. Hopefully you know the process and some of the sub-processes, and we'll review that again as well. Well, the anatomy of the respiratory tract begins in the nasal cavity. And the nasal cavity, the oral cavity, down into the pharynx, make up the upper respiratory tract. So within the nasal cavity, there's some separations between the oral and the nasal cavity. And of course, the separations are created by the bones of the ethmoid and the maxilla. They make up the palatine bones, right? So you remember you have a hard and soft palate, separating the oral and nasal cavity. And then at the back of the structure, you have the ethmoid bones. And remember that the vomer is that cool little bone that sticks up right in front of the maxilla, that separates the two sides of your nasal cavity. Within the nasal cavity or the meatuses, and remember a meatus is another word for a bulge. Remember there was the occipital meatus just behind your ear where your sternocleidomastoid attaches. And so you can see three meatuses within that nasal cavity. And these things are vestiges of nasal turbinates, all right? So in man, particularly, our capacity for smell is diminished. If you look at organisms that are really spending a lot of time close to the ground, like a cow or a sheep, they have these really, and dogs even, they have, very highly articulated uh, nasal conchi, these turbinates, these bones that are covered with tissue that allows them to have very, very um, advanced senses of smell. Anyway, those meatuses are vestiges of that. And as we move down the back of the nasal cavity, we come to the nasopharynx. All right. So the pharynx, in the past, remember I told you that it's made up of that weird a columnar, stratified columnar tissue, the weird stuff. You find it in the pharynx and you find it in the vas deferens in males. And so that odd tissue is in the back there, and it starts up top. And you actually have a couple sets of tonsils. Tonsils are structures you may have had out at the back of the throat or the palatine tonsils, but there's also another set of tonsils up deep in the sinuses there. The sinuses or the nasal sinus or the nasal pharynx is also where you have the opening of the eustachian tube. So you guys probably have experienced pain due to pressure changes. And remember, the eustachian tube is connected all the way out to your ear. And so by equilibrating pressures in your oral cavity, you can relieve some of that. And we'll talk about pressure in the respiratory system in a little bit of detail soon. One of the important features in the upper respiratory tract as we move down into the lower respiratory tract are these ciliated tissues. And we'll talk about those in detail as well. Moving down, past the pharynx, we get into the larynx. And the larynx is your voice box. It's this big cartilaginous structure. And of course, within the voice box, you have vocal cords. You have the epiglottis, which allows you to shut off your airway whenever you swallow. And then a series of cartilages that protect your airway, which is really critical to your safety and function, and also allow for this vocalization. The trachea is the main trunk leading to the lungs. It's a ciliated mucous membrane, and it's actually surrounded by cartilaginous rings. And again, a critical purpose of these rings is to maintain an open airway. In fact, they're incomplete C-shaped rings. All right, so they're closed in the front, and then they kind of have an opening towards the back of the throat where they rest against the vertebral column, and the trachea is a pretty tough tube, as you can imagine. One of the things that we'll look at is in the case of choking, how do you open up that trachea? And there's kind of some simple ways. As the trachea moves down into the lungs, it undergoes bifurcation, all right? And it bifurcates into the right and the left lung. And so we have two main stems of the bronchi, and bronchi bifurcate again into bronchioles. You'll notice that on the right side, I have three major bronchi, and on the left, I have two. And that refers back to the fact that there's 1, 2, 3 lobes in the right lung and only 2 lobes in the left lung. All right, so these trachea bifurcates into bronchi, which bifurcate further into bronchioles that have smaller and smaller diameter. And then finally, these bronchioles, these primary bronchi, secondary bronchioles, tertiary bronchioles, they finally end in these little blind sacs called the alveoli. And we'll look at that structure in detail in a sec. Well, the respiratory tract is a pseudocolumnar ciliated epithelium that is interspersed with goblet cells that make mucus. And cilia's function is to move that mucus, and it moves it in unidirectionally. Cilia is beating up, so you're making mucus, and the role of the mucus is to trap particulate matter and infectious agents, viruses, bacteria, even amoeboid, eukaryotic parasitic stuff. In fact, one of the ways you can get an amoebic infection in your lungs is by having birds. Birds are dirty. And the odd thing about birds is that the temperature of their skin is the same exact temperature as it is in your lungs. It's slightly cooler than 98 degrees. And so some of the parasites that infect birds' skin also infect your lungs. So if you have birds and you have asthma, get rid of your birds. Before we move down deeper into the system, let's talk about the nasal sinuses. So one of the roles of your oronasal cavity is to moisten and heat the air that's coming into your respiratory tract. And a big part of that happens in the sinuses, right? So air gets up into these hollow portions of your bone. Of course, one of the roles of the sinus is to make your skull lighter and light. In all structural engineering, you try to make things light and strong at the same time. So you have these big open spaces in your skull for the sinuses. They help your voice resonate. They help heat that and moisten that air. I'm sure there's other adaptive roles that it has that I'm not aware of. But of course, one of the things it can do is really cause you some problems with a process called sinusitis. So sinusitis, of course, is inflammation in the sinuses, and it can give you all kinds of problems like headaches. Remember, you're going to be inhaling all kinds of allergens and antigens in the environment, and those mast cells that are in the connective tissues that are around the sinuses are going to release histamine and causing swelling and fluid accumulation and pain and inflammation. And of course, one of the things you might be taking to relieve sinusitis is an antihistamine. Next is the larynx. The larynx is a voice box, and just beneath the epiglottis is an opening into the passage into the trachea, and just above it is the larynx, this big box made out of cartilage, and at the base of it you have these cool little vocal cords. If you've ever taken a couple blades of grass and blown air between them, you know how vocal cords work. And you have some muscular control down in your throat to allow you to manipulate the tension between the vocal cords. And it's one of these uniquely human capacities is to vocalize with speech. Or is it? So there's three cartilages in the larynx, the thyroid, cricoid, and epiglottic. The thyroid mentioned is the shut up, dog, is the cartilage that the thyroid gland lays on top of. Just beneath that is the cricoid, and then finally the epiglottic. And this is the epiglottic is up top. And of course the epiglottis is above the trachea and again closes off the trachea whenever you swallow. Which brings us to the possibility of opening the trachea with a tracheostomy. And, there's lots of examples. You may have experienced it in the past where you have a choking problem. And it's kind of a shame because everything's fine except your airway's been blocked. And so one of the things you can do is take some sharp object and puncture your trachea. You need to be sure to get through these cricoid cartilages just beneath the voice box at the base of the throat. And once you've opened a trachea up